All right, so you wanted to do a deep dive on preventing Alzheimer's, huh?
Seems like a pretty important topic, right?
For sure. I mean, who isn't at least a little worried about memory loss as they get older?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you sent over this video by Dr. Sten Ekberg, so let's dive into it.
Okay.
See what he has to say and pull out the most useful advice for all of us.
Sounds good.
I feel like Dr. Ekberg does a great job of addressing the difference between, like, normal everyday forgetfulness
Right.
and signs that something more serious might be going on.
Yeah, I think he really hits the nail on the head with that.
Like, I'm definitely guilty of forgetting why I walked into a room sometimes.
Oh, yeah, me too.
But I'm hoping that's not quite the same as, full-blown Alzheimer's.
No, definitely not. He makes the point that occasional memory slips are just part of being human.
Right.
Especially as we age.
Yeah.
And it's more about the pattern and the severity of those lapses.
Okay.
When they start interfering with your daily life,
Mm-hmm.
that's when it's time to pay closer attention.
Makes sense. So how does he explain how our memory actually works?
Well, he takes us all the way back to the beginning, to how our brains develop from childhood.
Okay.
And he describes this amazing burst of synapse formation in the first few years of life.
Wow.
Imagine at age 2, your brain is creating millions of new connections every single hour.
Our brains are like little powerhouses when we're kids.
They really are.
But what happens to all those connections? Do you keep all of them?
Well, our brains are actually really efficient.
Okay.
They go through this process called synaptic pruning,
Okay.
where they get rid of unused connections.
So like decluttering.
Exactly. Think of it like decluttering your closet.
Okay.
You get rid of the stuff you don't wear to make more room for the things you love.
So my brain was way more connected as a toddler than it is now.
In a way, yes.
That's kind of humbling.
But the connections that we do keep become stronger and more efficient.
Gotcha.
And the key is our brains keep adapting and changing throughout our lives.
So it's not all downhill after we hit a certain age.
Not at all. Dr. Ekberg is a big believer in what's called neuroplasticity,
Okay.
which basically means that our brains can rewire themselves, form new connections, and even create new brain cells throughout our lives.
That's reassuring.
It is pretty amazing.
So if we're constantly learning and challenging our brains, you can actually keep them young and healthy.
Exactly.
Okay.
He emphasizes that it's all about use it or lose it. The more we engage our minds, the stronger those connections become.
Right.
And the more resilient our brains are to age-related decline.
I like that. So, okay, our brains are constantly adapting.
Right.
But Dr. Ekberg also talks about memory being selective, right?
Yes. He points out that our brains are actually designed to prioritize the information that's most relevant to us.
Interesting.
So for some people, that might be remembering names and faces.
Okay.
Because social connections are really important to them.
Yeah.
For others, it might be remembering facts and figures.
Right.
Or even song lyrics.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It really depends on the person.
I can definitely relate to that. I'm much better at remembering concepts and ideas than names.
Right.
For example.
And that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Our brains are wired differently.
Okay.
And what we prioritize in our memories reflects our individual needs and values.
That actually makes me feel a little bit better about my sometimes spotty memory.
Well, and here's something that might surprise you.
Okay.
Dr. Ekberg actually suggests that having a perfect memory might not be such a good thing.
Really?
Yeah, he links it to some mental health challenges.
Why would that be?
Well, imagine constantly replaying every embarrassing moment or
Oh.
painful experience you've ever had.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be very fun, would it?
No, not at all.
Our brains have evolved to filter out some of that negativity.
Right.
To protect us.
I guess forgetting can be a blessing in disguise sometimes.
Exactly. It's all about balance.
Right.
But there is a point where forgetfulness crosses the line from normal to concerning.
Okay, that's what I was wondering about. How do we know when it's time to be worried?
He says the real warning sign is when you start forgetting things that you've actively tried to remember.
Okay.
Things that are important to you.
Gotcha.
He gives the example of struggling to learn new languages now.
Okay.
Something that used to come easily to him when he was younger.
So if we're finding it harder to learn new things, or if we're forgetting important information even after making an effort to remember it,
Yeah.
that could be a sign that something's up.
Right. It's like your brain hard drive is starting to get fragmented.
Okay.
It's not a guarantee that something serious is wrong.
Right.
But it's definitely a signal to pay closer attention to your brain health.
So what can we actually do to support our brain health and potentially avoid those warning signs?
Well, that's a great question, and it's something we'll dive into a lot more in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
But he stresses that it's not about finding one magic solution,
Right.
but adapting a holistic approach.
Mm-hmm.
And his first pillar is all about energy.
Okay.
He reminds us that our brains are incredible energy hogs.
Really?
consuming a huge chunk of our body's total energy.
So our brains need a lot of fuel to function properly.
Yes, they do.
Where does that fuel come from?
Primarily from glucose,
Okay.
which comes from the carbohydrates we eat.
Mm-hmm.
But he also highlights the importance of ketones,
Okay.
which our bodies produce when we burn fat for fuel.
So what we eat plays a huge role in keeping our brains powered up.
Absolutely.
I'm guessing this is where the whole Mediterranean diet thing comes in.
Well, he definitely advocates for a whole foods diet,
Okay.
but he goes beyond just labeling it Mediterranean.
Right.
He emphasizes the importance of real unprocessed foods.
Okay.
Things like grass-fed meats,
Mm-hmm.
wild-caught fish, organic vegetables and fruits,
Right.
nuts and seeds, healthy fats.
I see.
He also talks about minimizing processed foods, refined sugars, and industrial seed oil.
He also mentioned a pretty shocking statistic.
Oh, yeah.
Only about 1 to 2% of the items in a typical supermarket actually qualify as real whole foods.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of how far we've strayed from how our ancestors ate.
Right.
But even if we can't perfectly recreate their diets,
Yeah.
every step we take towards eating more whole foods
Mm-hmm.
is a step in the right direction.
So it's not about being perfect,
Right.
but about making conscious choices to nourish our brains with the best possible fuel,
Exactly.
along with fueling our brains.
Yeah.
Dr. Ekberg also emphasizes the importance of stimulating them through movement.
That's right.
He's a big believer in exercise, right?
He is.
I remember him saying something about how 90% of our brain stimulation comes from movement.
Yeah. And that's really how our ancestors lived.
Right.
They didn't have gyms or Peloton bikes.
They were just constantly moving.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For most of human history, we were constantly moving, whether we were hunting, gathering, or just going about our daily lives. Our
Right.
brains evolved to thrive in that environment.
Okay.
But in today's world,
Yeah.
many of us are sitting for hours on end,
Right.
which means our brains are missing out on that crucial stimulation.
So we need to move our bodies to keep our brains engaged.
That's right.
What kind of movement is best?
Well, he actually recommends a mix of both low-intensity and high-intensity exercise.
Okay.
And he says that variety is key.
Okay.
Think of it like this.
Mm-hmm.
Our ancestors didn't just run sprints all day.
Right.
They also walked long distances,
Yeah.
climbed trees, lifted heavy objects.
Right.
Their lives demanded a wide range of physical activities.
So our workouts should mimic that variety.
You got it.
So maybe some walking, some strength training, and then some bursts of high-intensity cardio.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that even simple things like walking
Okay.
can have a huge impact on our brain health.
Really?
He actually calls it the foundation
Wow.
of physical activity for brain health.
Okay.
And on the other end of the spectrum, he's a big fan of high-intensity interval training, or HIIT,
Right.
which mimics those bursts of energy our ancestors needed for hunting or escaping danger.
I can definitely see the appeal of high workouts. They're over quickly.
Yeah, they are.
But I'm curious what's happening in our brains when we do those high-intensity workouts.
Mhm.
Is there something specific about them that benefits brain health?
Well, one key benefit is that high-intensity exercise boosts something called BDNF,
Okay.
or brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
What is that?
He calls this miracle grow for the brain,
Miracle grow for the brain.
and for good reason.
Tell me more.
BDNF is a protein that's essential for the growth, survival, and function of brain cells.
Okay.
It helps create new connections, strengthens existing ones,
Okay.
and even protects brain cells from damage.
Wow.
So in essence, it's like giving your brain the nutrients it needs to thrive.
So by incorporating some high-intensity exercise into our routines, we can actually help our brains stay younger and healthier.
Exactly.
I like it.
And the good news is you don't have to spend hours in the gym to reap the benefits.
That's good.
Even short bursts of high-intensity exercise a few times a week, okay, can make a big difference.
This is all starting to make sense.
We're
We're feeding our brains with the right pool. We're stimulating them with movement.
Mhm.
What else does Dr. Ekberg emphasize for brain health?
He's very clear about the importance of sleep,
Okay.
and not just any sleep, but deep sleep.
I've definitely heard that sleep is important.
Yeah.
But why is deep sleep so crucial for our brains?
Well, during deep sleep, our brains go into a sort of cleaning mode.
Okay.
Specialized cells called glial cells get to work removing waste products,
Okay.
including harmful proteins that have been linked to Alzheimer's disease.
So while we're sleeping, our brains are busy taking out the trash.
It is.
That's wild.
And he points out that this cleaning process is much more efficient during sleep
Right.
than when we're awake.
So skimping on sleep is like letting the garbage pile up in your brain?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. I'm officially convinced I'm getting 8 hours tonight.
Good.
But seriously, this is all really interesting.
Yeah.
So far, we've covered energy from food, stimulation from movement,
Yeah.
and cleanup from sleep.
Right.
What else does Dr. Ekberg highlight as essential for brain health?
Well, he talks quite a bit about the impact of stress,
Okay.
and not just in the way that we typically think about it.
What do you mean?
So it's not just about feeling overwhelmed or anxious,
Right.
but about how stress actually affects our brains on a physical level.
Oh, okay.
He explains that when we're chronically stressed,
Mm-hmm.
our brains get stuck in a sort of survival mode.
Okay.
This triggers the release of hormones that, over time, can actually damage brain cells and impair memory function.
That's kind of scary.
It is. It's like our brains are constantly on high alert,
Right.
and that's taking a toll.
Yeah.
It's the analogy of a car-ism.
Okay.
If you keep it revving at high speed all the time,
Mm-hmm.
it's eventually going to burn out.
Right.
And the same principle applies to our brains.
So managing stress is about more than just feeling better in the moment.
Yes.
It's about protecting our brains for the long haul.
Exactly.
But what does Dr. Ekberg recommend for actually managing stress?
Well, he suggests a variety of things,
Okay.
but he emphasizes that consistency is key.
Right.
He's a big believer in mindfulness practices like meditation,
Okay.
deep breathing exercises,
Mm-hmm.
and spending time in nature.
I like that.
He also stresses the importance of social connection
Right.
and engaging in activities that bring us joy.
That makes a lot of sense.
It is.
It's about finding healthy outlets for stress and incorporating those activities into our daily routine.
Exactly. It's about building resilience,
Yeah.
both mentally and emotionally, so that our brains can handle the inevitable ups and downs of life.
I love that. It's not about avoiding stress altogether,
Right.
but about equipping our brains to deal with it effectively.
Exactly. And on that note,
Yeah.
Dr. Ekberg is also incredibly passionate about the power of lifelong learning.
Okay.
He believes it's one of the most powerful tools we have for maintaining brain health.
I've definitely heard that keeping our brains active is important.
Yeah.
But how does learning actually help prevent cognitive decline?
Well, he describes learning as a way to build what's called cognitive reserve.
Okay, what is that?
Think of it like creating backup systems for your brain.
Interesting.
The more you learn, the more connections you create,
Right.
and the more pathways your brain has to access information.
So even if some pathways start to weaken with age, there are other routes for the brain to take.
It is.
That's a cool way to think about it.
It is. And he gives the example of learning a new language,
Mm-hmm.
which he says can reduce dementia risk by a significant percentage.
Wow, that's impressive.
It is.
So it's not just about doing crossword puzzles,
Right.
but about challenging ourselves with new skills and knowledge.
Exactly. It's about feeding our curiosity, expanding our horizons, and keeping our brains engaged with the world around us.
This is all so fascinating, but my brain is starting to feel a little full.
I know, right?
We've covered a lot of ground in this first part
We have.
of our deep dive into Dr. Ekberg's advice.
Mhm.
We've talked about energy, movement,
Yes.
sleep, stress management,
Right.
and lifelong learning.
That's right. It's a lot to take in.
It is a lot to take in.
But I think that's what's so great about his approach.
Yeah.
He acknowledges that brain health isn't about one single thing,
Right.
but about creating a lifestyle that supports our brains in multiple ways.
It's about weaving all these different threads together to create a tapestry of brain health.
Exactly. And while it might seem overwhelming at first,
Yeah,
it's important to remember that even small changes can make a big difference.
that's good to hear.
It is.
So what are some of the specific strategies that Dr. Ekberg recommends for putting all this knowledge into practice?
Well, that's exactly what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
Excellent.
We'll be diving into his specific recommendations for food,
Okay.
exercise, sleep, stress management, and more.
I'm ready for more brain-boosting strategies. Be sure to join us for part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll continue unpacking Dr. Ekberg's wisdom on preventing Alzheimer's.
It's going to be good.
It's fascinating how Dr. Ekberg connects all these different aspects of our lifestyle to brain health.
I agree.
It's not just about one thing. It's
Right.
about the bigger picture.
Yeah, and one of the things that he talks about is how our modern lives
Mm-hmm.
are often out of sync with how our brains were designed to function.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. For most of human history,
Okay.
we lived in a world without smartphones,
Right.
processed food,
Yeah.
247 news cycles.
For sure.
Our ancestors were constantly moving. Their diets were based on whole foods,
Right.
and they lived in tune with the natural rhythms of day and night.
So our modern environment is kind of like an alien planet for our brains.
In a way, yes, our brains are still wired for that ancient world,
Right.
but we're now living in an environment that's radically different.
That makes sense. So how do we bridge that gap?
Yeah.
We can't exactly go back to living in caves and hunting for our food.
Right, but we can learn from our ancestors.
Okay.
and make choices that align our lives with our brain's evolutionary needs.
Okay, so what are some practical things we can do? Where do we even begin?
Well, he suggests starting with small, sustainable changes.
Okay,
Don't try to overhaul your entire life overnight.
right.
Focus on one or two things that you can realistically change.
So instead of trying to become a marathon runner tomorrow, maybe just aim for a 20-minute walk a few times a week.
Exactly. Or maybe swap out one sugary drink a day for a glass of water.
Okay,
It's about building healthy habits over time.
that makes it seem much less daunting. What about diet? I know we touched on this earlier,
Yeah.
but what are some specific foods that Dr. Ekberg recommends?
He's a huge advocate for whole unprocessed foods.
Okay,
Things like grass-fed meats, wild-caught fish, organic fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, healthy fats.
okay.
He also talks about minimizing processed foods, refined sugars, and industrial seed oils.
I'll admit I do have a bit of a sweet tooth,
Yeah.
but I'm willing to try cutting back if it means protecting my brain.
And remember, it's not about being perfect.
Right.
Every small step you take toward eating more whole foods is a step in the right direction.
One thing I'm definitely guilty of is not getting enough sleep.
Oh, yeah.
I tend to burn the candle at both ends.
Yeah.
Is that something Dr. Ekberg talks about?
He is very clear that sleep is non-negotiable
Okay.
when it comes to brain health.
Right.
He recommends aiming for 7 to 8 hours of quality sleep each night.
Easier said than done sometimes.
I know.
But why is sleep so important for our brains?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, deep sleep is when our brains do their most important cleaning
Right.
and repair work.
Mm-hmm.
It's like taking your brain to the spa each night.
Okay, that's a good way to think about it.
It is.
I'm definitely going to prioritize sleep more seriously now. What about stress? I feel like that's a constant in modern life.
It is. But he explains that chronic stress
Yeah.
can have a devastating impact on our brains.
Wow.
He actually compares it to having a saber-toothed tiger constantly chasing you.
Oh my gosh.
It keeps your brain in a state of high alert,
Right.
which depletes its resources
Yeah,
and impairs its ability to function properly.
I can definitely relate to that feeling. So how do we tame that inner saber-toothed tiger?
He recommends a variety of stress-reducing techniques,
Okay.
but he emphasizes that finding what works for you and practicing it regularly is key.
So things like meditation, breathing, exercises, spending time in nature, those kinds of things.
Exactly, and he's also a big believer in nurturing social connections.
Right.
He points out that humans are social creatures by nature,
Yeah,
and feeling connected to others is essential for our well-being,
for sure.
both mentally and emotionally.
That makes sense. I know I always feel better after spending time with friends or family.
Yeah.
It's like a stress antidote.
It is, and laughter is another powerful stress reliever.
Okay.
He encourages us to find humor in everyday life and to not take ourselves too seriously.
I like that advice. It sounds like a prescription for a more joyful life. What else does Dr. Ekberg highlight for preventing cognitive decline?
He is incredibly passionate about the power of lifelong learning.
Okay.
He believes it's one of the best ways to build what's called cognitive reserve.
We talked about that earlier, right?
Yeah.
It's like creating backup systems for your brain.
Right.
So that if one area weakens, there are other pathways to access information.
Right. And he points out that learning new things
Mm-hmm.
keeps our brains challenged and engaged,
Right.
which helps to strengthen those neural connections.
So what are some examples of brain-boosting activities? Is it all about things like Sudoku and crossword puzzles?
Those could be helpful, but he encourages us to think beyond traditional brain games.
Okay.
He suggests activities like learning a new language,
Okay.
picking up a musical instrument, taking up a new hobby,
Right.
or even just having deep, meaningful conversations with others.
So it's about finding activities that we genuinely enjoy and that challenge us in new and interesting ways.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that it's never too late to start learning.
That's good to hear.
Our brains have an amazing capacity to adapt and grow throughout our lives.
That's good news for those of us who might be feeling a little late to the game.
It is. It's a reminder that we have a lot more control over our brain health than we might think.
I have to say, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this information.
I know.
It's like, okay, I need to eat perfectly, sleep, 8 hours, exercise every day, meditate, learn a new language, and save the rainforest.
Right.
How do we even begin to implement all of this?
That's a valid point.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that we don't have to do everything perfectly.
Okay.
Progress, not perfection, is the key.
Right.
Start with one small change.
Mm-hmm.
And once that becomes a habit, add another.
Okay.
Celebrate your wins, be patient with yourself, and focus on the long game.
I love that. Progress, not perfection. It takes the pressure off.
It does.
And it reminds us that even small steps can move us in the right direction.
Precisely. It's about creating a sustainable lifestyle that supports our brain health over the long term.
Okay.
It's not a sprint. It's a marathon.
Dr. Ekberg really packs a lot into his videos.
She does.
It's inspiring, but it's also a lot to process.
Yeah.
What are your biggest takeaways from everything we've covered so far?
For me, it's the emphasis on aligning our modern lives with our brain's evolutionary needs.
Yeah.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not machines,
Right.
but biological beings with a deep connection to the natural world.
And that by tapping into that connection, by moving our bodies, nourishing ourselves with whole foods, getting enough sleep, managing stress, and engaging our minds, we can unlock our brain's full potential.
It's a beautiful concept, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it gives me hope.
Yeah,
Hope that we can age gracefully with vitality and cognitive clarity.
and that's a hope worth holding on to.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
But there are a few more gems of wisdom from Dr. Ekberg that I'm eager to explore.
I'm ready for more.
Great. Join us for the final part of this episode where we'll delve into some even more fascinating insights from Dr. Ekberg's video. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Dr. Ekberg's advice on preventing Alzheimer's.
All right.
And, it's been really encouraging to learn about all the things we can do to support our brain health.
Definitely.
But I'm curious, does Dr. Ekberg talk about what happens when things don't go so well? Like when someone actually starts showing signs of cognitive decline?
He does touch on that, and he makes a point that I found really interesting.
Okay.
He suggests that in many cases, a diagnosis of Alzheimer's often comes too late.
Really?
Yeah, by the time someone is showing clear symptoms, the damage has already been done.
So it's like we're missing a crucial window of opportunity.
That's exactly what he's getting at.
Okay.
He really emphasizes the importance of proactive prevention.
Right.
Instead of waiting for symptoms to appear, he believes we should be focusing on creating a lifestyle that supports brain health from the very beginning.
That makes sense. It's like waiting until your car breaks down to change the oil.
Exactly.
That's probably a little too late at that point.
Yeah, he advocates for a complete shift in our thinking, from a reactive approach to a proactive one.
So we shouldn't be waiting for things to go wrong.
Right.
We should be building a strong foundation for brain health throughout our lives.
Exactly.
I like that it's about being proactive, not just reactive.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the biggest challenges is that our modern world seems to be working against us in many ways.
Yeah.
We're surrounded by processed foods, technology, constant stimulation.
It's true.
It's hard to escape that.
He addresses this directly, and he brings up this really interesting comparison.
Okay.
He says the world has changed more in the last 50 years than it did in the previous 50,000.
Wow, that puts things in perspective. But how does that rapid change affect our brains?
Well, think about it. Our ancestors evolved in a world without cars, smartphones,
Right.
artificial lights,
Yeah,
or the constant barrage of information we're exposed to today.
for sure.
Their lives were physically demanding. They ate whole, unprocessed foods, and their stress levels were likely much lower.
Yeah, probably.
Their environment, in many ways, supported their brain health.
So in a way, we're living with brains that were designed for a different world.
That's exactly what he's suggesting.
Okay.
Now, he's not saying that we need to reject all technology and go live in the woods,
Right.
but he is pointing out that this mismatch between our modern environment
Right.
and our brain's evolutionary needs
Right.
could be contributing to the rise in cognitive decline.
It's like we're running our brains on outdated software and it's starting to glitch.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks.
And his message is that we have a choice.
Okay.
We can either passively accept the trajectory of modern life, or we can actively create a lifestyle that supports our brain health despite these challenges.
So how do we do that? How do we bridge the gap between our ancient brains and our modern world?
He suggests a two-pronged approach.
Okay.
First, we need to be aware of the potential downsides of modern life.
Okay.
Things like excessive screen time, processed foods,
Right.
chronic stress, and sleep deprivation.
Yeah.
And then we need to make conscious choices to mitigate those risks.
So things like setting boundaries with technology, prioritizing sleep, managing stress,
Yep.
and nourishing our bodies with real food.
It's not about rejecting the modern world entirely,
Right.
but about finding a balance,
Okay.
a way to honor our evolutionary heritage while still embracing the best of what technology and modern life have to offer.
It's like finding a way to live in the modern world without letting it take over our lives and hijack our brains.
That's a great way to put it.
Yes.
It's about taking back control and making choices that support our well-being,
Right.
both physically and mentally.
You know what strikes me about Dr. Ekberg's message is that it's not just about preventing disease.
Right.
It's about living a more fulfilling life.
Yeah.
It's about having the energy, the focus, and the mental clarity to truly enjoy our lives.
I agree, and that's what makes this whole conversation about brain health so compelling.
Yeah.
It's not just about avoiding something negative.
Right.
It's about actively pursuing something positive.
It's about living our best lives mentally and physically. And I have to say, after diving into all of this information, I'm feeling much more hopeful than when we started.
Me too. It's empowering to realize that we're not simply victims of our genes or our circumstances.
Right.
We have the power to shape our own health destiny,
Yeah.
including the health of our brains.
Absolutely, and that's a message worth sharing. Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into Dr. Ekberg's wisdom.
It really has.
Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
And for sending in this fantastic video.
Of course.
It's been a real pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Likewise.
And to all of you listening, remember, knowledge is power, but action is where the real magic happens.
So true.
So take what you've learned from this deep dive and start incorporating it into your life one small step at a time. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep diving deep.